Can you hear it loud? The world is ready. Stand up proud. Your story is power. Your passion's the spark. With Innovate AI and i3, you'll leave your mark.
I want to pose a question to you. How big would you dream? How big would you dream if you knew you couldn't fail? Think about that. What would that look like? What would you do differently than what you're doing now if you knew with every fiber of your being, whatever you did, you couldn't fail, right? I think part of that comes down to figuring out how you think about failure and what it really is. And I'll talk about that in a minute. For me, I had to redefine failure as there's no such thing as failure, it's only feedback, right? How many of you have had some feedback in your life, in your business? Think about it. And so viewing that, and I'm a lifelong learner, and some of you that were in the last session know that about me, but I want to welcome you to this session where we're going to talk a little bit about your business, your psychology, how AI fits in. This isn't really a heavy AI session, but talking about strategy a little bit more. I want to do a quick shout out to CBRE, who's sponsoring this space and this day for us as well. If you haven't discovered, I mentioned at the end of the last session, there's a little fridge around the corner if you want to grab a beverage. There is water there, water cups, a little water station, so feel free to help yourself to that. And then the bathroom, if you need it. There's a bathroom in here. Obviously, there's some other ones out in the main, but this is probably the closest one to go to. So obviously, take advantage of that. By way of background, I don't want to be too redundant for some of you, but for some of you who weren't here last session, I'm Dr. Eric Goodman, and I'm a recovered academic, truth be told. I earned my PhD at CU Boulder in business, was a professor, spent many years as an administrator, as a department chair, over a decade as a business school dean, including running one of the largest colleges of business in the nation, and many years as a VP, chief academic officer, overseeing all of academics. And so I'm passionate, and I was just sharing this with Anna, who came up to talk to me in between the sessions, about helping people not make stupid mistakes, right? And having created programs in entrepreneurship and all sorts of every aspect of business, from undergrad to doctorate level programs that I oversaw, part of that is not reinventing the wheel, whether it was custom corporate training, executive MBAs, certificate programs. It really didn't matter. It was about learning something that's going to help you do better in life, and of course in business being a part of your life. But one of the things I'm passionate about is technology, and we'll hear more about that. I'm not going to go into depth, but those are some images of some things that I grew up with. The first thing being my dad, who was a technology. He was an engineer, self-taught. He actually never got a degree. He went to a little electrical circuitry school on Navy Pier. He grew up on the south side of Chicago in the projects. Couldn't afford to go to college, but he took this little training class and got a job with Western Electric, the Hawthorne plant. Some of you may have probably heard of the Hawthorne studies, if you are familiar with that. But at any rate, he grew up with technology. That first image there, he brought home something that Western Electric built, which is a little modem coupler, one of the first things that actually, we think about the evolution of being able to connect through something. I remember playing a game. He brought home this briefcase, opened it up, and I had this little keyboard and could turn and move the thing using the left and the right and the up and down buttons to go on a treasure hunt, to find something. And it was like we had this, it would type out then messages. I'm like, oh my God, this is really cool. Like, who's actually behind this? I was fascinated by it, right? But ultimately, love technology, Mac computers. I was that kid that had the cell phone in the pouch, the Motorola brick thing, and every gadget you name it, the pagers, and whenever things came out, GPS, didn't matter. It's like, I want that because I recognize that there's power in it to make my life better. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you today are some things that I think will make your life better. Even if you walk away with one idea, I'm so happy because it pains me when I see companies fail. And I remember I was on the board of directors for one of the chambers here in Colorado. And, you know, companies come and go. but there's no reason for it. How many of you are solopreneurs? How many of you want to be solopreneurs or wantrepreneurs, right? Ultimately, it can be a lonely road. And so part of my commitment is creating opportunities for people to connect and learn from each other and creating a community. And we'll talk more about that in just a second, which is right now. Because there's some opportunities to actually connect through something we're doing. And if you didn't, when you came in on the door, you'll see these little posters that say Ignite Your AI Challenge. I want you to scan that and check in, and you'll get some details about a fun challenge we're having. We're gamifying Startup Week, basically, so that you can earn opportunities for other things, to actually have an impossible goal generator, so that you can dream that big and make it happen. And I've had individuals that have used just that tool. It was actually just intended to create an impossible goal. But I've had individuals that followed up and said, I've been using your tool, and I built my whole business plan and all these other things with it. It knows me better than I know myself. And I'm using it for marketing and other things. So ultimately, that's invaluable for you to have access to. But that's just one example. Some of you were for the Ignite Your Passion session last time, opportunities for that. But all we're asking you to do is share what you're doing and stop hiding. Not that you're hiding, but some of you are. I know I did. I didn't want to be on any social media. That was me just 2 years ago. Like private Facebook, like I don't want anyone knowing my business, what I'm doing. LinkedIn, I didn't want to connect with people. Now I've got over close to 11,000 followers on LinkedIn. So technically I'm an influencer on LinkedIn. But that's how quickly you can become visible if you start sharing and posting things. So we're inviting you to snap some pictures. There's also a kiosk back there for a selfie station. We're also hosting a mixer at Lucky Strike tonight on 16th Street Mall, where there'll be a bigger selfie station set up with all those fun things, the props and whatnot. But we want you to do that, and we want you to post reels, even just sharing something you learned with other people so that we can spread the wealth. I wish I could be at all these other sessions right now, learning from other people. And so one of the things that you'll also get when you check in is access, if you'd like, to all the recordings that we're doing. For all the sessions today, we're also going to be hosted by Silver City, Denver, on Larimer Street at an event center there tomorrow for another day of powerful sessions. So when you scan that, you'll get access to that. And then also, the community doesn't have to stop here. Why is it once a year entrepreneurs come together? So I also run a networking group in the South Metro area, and we host events in conjunction with the Lineable downtown. But ultimately, we have a community of people that get together and mastermind every month to talk about a business topic that's relevant. So it's powerful, but within this code scan, you'll also be invited to join AI Nation, which is a community that we're going to continue sharing information about AI with you. But what happens when you scan this particular code, besides the check-in, is you'll be invited to actually retrieve your event photos. And it'll take you to a screen where you are asked to put your information. And AI, the power of it, anyone know about facial recognition? Pretty powerful stuff, right? So this is a fun facial recognition thing. You can take a selfie, and then it tags you, basically. So every picture that's taken, whether it's you going to the selfie station, whether it's Stephen Murphy, who's doing some roving pictures throughout the whole day and this evening, you'll have your personalized photo album show up. And you can actually just click on share, and it'll pull up all your social media things that you can then very easily share that out with the world as well. As of course, but you can take all sorts of things with your own device. So we encourage you to do that. So I wanted to share that with you before we get started. So I have had the privilege of going through, anyone heard of Dr. Benjamin Hardy? Oh my God, wow. You guys need to know about who he is. And he has written a series of books, and I've gone through a couple programs. Well, you probably would, there'd be more hands. He was just here in Colorado for one of the first times ever at the Conscious Entrepreneur Summit at the end of May, and I spent a half a day with him. And ultimately, he's wrote a number of books, but he wrote this book called 10x is easier than 2x. Okay? And when you think about that idea of the impossible goal, it's a really relevant thing, because ultimately, does it take any more work, do you think, to make, let's say, $50,000 or $100,000 or $1 million? Is it more work to do that? or $2 million. Yeah.
It physically can't be because we all have the same amount of time.
Yeah, right. So it's how you do that and what's the leverage. And when you focus on what truly matters and you get rid of those inauthentic expectations of others, and some of you heard my story about that, maybe not living a life true to myself and pleasing others or doing other things versus focusing on what I was put on this planet to do, right? It makes a huge difference. So when you break free from those expectations that you have an opportunity to do that. Who had heard of Benjamin Hardy? Raise your hand again. Who's read this book? Okay, who's heard of him that hasn't read the book? All right, I'm going to give you this copy. So ultimately, it's a powerful book. It's one of many. He's got a new book called Scaling.com, and the workshop that I went to and the time I spent with him this last year, starting last fall, is around scaling a company and growing it. Now, his program's a little bit more higher end. You've already got to be a little bit more established, making at least $1 million in revenue to go into it. However, the principles apply to any business at any size, and they're powerful. And as somebody who's been a business strategist for decades, I can tell you that he's taken and distilled a lot of the science that's out there and actually created a model, a framework for rethinking what we thought were the business growth models, in essence, because it's embracing your true calling and following that up. Who's heard of the Pareto principle? Anyone heard of that? What is the Pareto principle? Someone shout it out. 80-20. What does that mean? 20% that moves 80%. Thank you.
It's a verbal form of the power law.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So the reality is when you think about your day or your life, I was driving down I-25 today, this morning. There is a little bit of traffic. Anyone come on I-25? Right? You think about it, 20% of the roads have 80% of the traffic. 80% of the roads have 20% of the traffic. The Pareto principle was, Pareto was an Italian economist who looked at agriculture and agrarian economies and understanding crop yields and things like that. But it's true in life, in everything you do. And ultimately, I'll work with my clients sometimes and say, let's make a list of your clients. Who are they? Who are your partners, your vendors? And sometimes they list that out. And as we look at that and we start breaking it down in terms of those high maintenance, those clients, but also those clients that are earning them the most revenue, what we inevitably find is that 20% of their clients contribute to 80% of their revenue. 80% of their clients are giving them 20% of the revenue, the law of diminishing returns, right? Marginal.
But that's only 40%. What about the other 60%?
No, you've got 80 and 20. So ultimately, combined, you've got 100% of your time. So are you focusing on 80% of your time on those clients that are bringing you 20% of your revenue? Or are you focusing your time on those 20% that give you 80%? Because what happens is, and I said, you got to fire some of your clients in a polite way. But you know what? Imagine if you expanded that 20% and had, since they're contributing 80%, if you got rid of that 80% that only marginally giving you 20%, what does that do for you? It frees you up. It's scary as hell to do that, but it's ultimately an opportunity to redefine yourself and eliminate those things that aren't of value to you. And you can apply the same principle in terms of your health, your wellness, your nutrition. It doesn't matter what it is. He wrote some other books, like Who Not How, The Gap in the Gain. And I invite you to think about the resources as entrepreneurs. And I shared this in the last session. Everything you need for your business is in this room. Undoubtedly. I've yet to see that not happen. But it's understanding what are the resources, what are the values, what are the experiences that other people can bring to you. And even if it's somebody as you're growing and scaling, you're thinking about who could I contract with? How could I involve these people? Or how can I collaborate with them in a way that we can grow each other's business? Or maybe even create something new, right? There's a lot of different strategies for market entry and expanding your reach or creating something new and finding that blue ocean, if you will. But ultimately, it's about rethinking those things that no longer serve you and eliminating them. And I know for me, recently, it's been going through things. For the last session, I just shared that my mom passed about 9 months ago. So I've been going through her stuff, figuring out like, okay, there's a lot of stuff, 100% of the stuff. It's like, what is that 20% of what she had that I really want, that I value with my heart, that gives me joy, brings me pleasure? Same thing in your closet. Like, how many outfits do you have? How many clothes do you have? How often do you wear them? Right? Think about it. It applies to everything in life. When you focus on what truly matters, you can get exponential results. The status quo is your enemy. The challenge is, again, most of you are playing small, right? Why? You're thinking small. Again, how big would you dream if you knew you couldn't fail? And what's stopping you? Because time isn't going to wait for you in terms of that. And ultimately, when we look at exponential growth for the purpose of this framework, for me, it's about freeing yourself up and having more time. And to exponentially do that, AI is a game changer because it can help you automate those systems. Because you don't need to have all these employees you're hiring. You can employ those AI agents 24/7. They don't get sick. They don't call in. They're not going to argue with you, maybe a little bit, depending on how they're programmed or created. But in general, it's a really powerful thing to think about the automation. The other thing is up here. 90%, probably 99% of it is really up here in terms of your mindset and those limiting beliefs that have held you back up until now. Because that has a powerful influence on you. And when you understand that, and not just the power of persuasion and skills and sales and other things, but understanding, persuading yourself. You probably say things to yourself that you would never dare to say to somebody else, right? Beating yourself up, demeaning yourself, self-doubt, critical thinking. So just stop it, right? It is that easy, but no, it's being aware of it. That little voice that now you're like, oh, you're not good enough, you're not strong enough, you're not worthy of that, you don't deserve it, whatever it is. Think about those messages and recognize them when you hear them. Just say, well, wait a minute. Says who? And understand who that is. What part of you is expressing that because they've learned ways of coping in the past where maybe, again, failure meant something different than feedback. But again, you create your own reality through your perception. So when you start perceiving feedback instead of failure, you know what? I want to fail frickin' fast because I can grow, right? Think about that. Think about how different that is as an example. And when you talk about strategic positioning, how do you create a dominant market space that can stand the test of time? What does that look like? And it really starts with something we were talking about in the last session about your North Star. As a company, as an individual, what does that look like? What are the values that stand the test of time that are going to help you? But also, where do you identify those things? Because most of the time, there's a lot of Me Too's out there. Companies, they see something and it's like, oh, this is trending. We better jump on it. We need to launch something. Are you really listening to the voice of the customer? Are you understanding what do they want? And are you also thinking ahead about how you can bring other things to them, just like Steve Jobs would have done with the Apple, like the iPod, the iPhone, like things that people are like, well, I didn't know I needed that until I saw it, right? But you create that market demand. You find that blue ocean because what happens otherwise, you're in a bloody red ocean and you're competing on price. But when you can differentiate yourself, and what's the most important thing in your business? It's you, right? Think about it. It's not your products, it's not your service, it's you. What you bring to it is the most important thing. And it starts with this in terms of what you're focusing on and how you're thinking about what you're doing in your business. And why it works is because you can actually use a framework that's flexible in 10x, and you can reduce your costs because a lot of the costs you have are for things that you don't need. And I'll share a perfect example. There's systems out there that allow you to be more efficient with what you're doing. And I know I've got probably 100 different tools that I subscribe to, or I did a couple of years ago. I'm narrowing that down. I'm figuring out, like, you know what? I'm paying however much a month for this tool. And when was the last time I used it? Is it in that 80% category? What are the core things that really are important for me to be able to eliminate that. And also, when you think about this framework, you can grab the velocity and the speed to market and that speed to failure as well. The other thing is, don't overthink it. That's my best advice, because I have been that person. I talked about that. That's what a PhD program, any other people in a PhD or finished a PhD program? Okay. So you know, like, your brain is forever changed after that experience. And I saw that happen with dozens of students that went through, like, the doctoral programs that I was overseeing. But ultimately, the analysis, it's paralysis by analysis. Don't let that happen to you. It's speed to market. And AI, it's here to stay. Make no mistake. I remember I was a dean of a business school. This was back .com timeframe. And there's an organization called AACSB, which is the accrediting body for a lot of business schools. And I was at a conference, and they were talking about this thing with the internet and how it's going to change and how we needed to adjust our curriculum to have a course in e-marketing and maybe e-HR and e-law and e-whatever. And I remember, I was like, you guys just don't get it. Like, this is not like discipline specific. Our world is forever changed with the internet. It's going to infuse everything that we're doing with our curriculum. So we need to make sure, rather than creating a different version of a course, it becomes the DNA in each course. And so ultimately, that's what we're seeing now with AI. And universities are actually, there's a few of them that are progressive enough that have launched AI, programs and degrees and certificates. But really, the reality is, and I can say this, having served as a dean of one of the largest colleges of business in the US, that most of education, and that's why I'm a recovered academic, because I remember, and I've got 2 daughters as well, and paying 6 figures to get them through college, obviously, is not a small investment. But the reality is, everything you need is at your fingertips. You've got more information that you can access than ever before in human history. And the rate of it multiplying, it used to be like going back to Aristotle and Plato, they'd gather in a square. All the information you needed to know from the last 1,000 years, they could share in a couple minutes, right? Maybe not a couple minutes, but you could distill it. And then fast forward, the rate of information acceleration changed dramatically with the industrial age, where then rather than thousands of years, it was doubling every 25 years and different time frames as well. Yeah, question.
So I'm a master's student at CU, and why do you think that professors are behind the times and they say, like, absolutely no AI use whatsoever? And I'm like, any sort of grammar thing is
sure.
Turn it in.
Absolutely.
AI.
Yep.
If we're not training a modern workforce to use AI and incorporate it,
Yep.
businesses expect you to be AI ready when you come in.
Exactly.
So why are professors like, absolutely no use of AI?
Well, so part of that, let me share my perspective on it. And I've led thousands of faculty. Some of the universities I was at, we had multiple locations and everything else. So I've worked with a lot of faculty over the years. There's an ivory tower. There's a process of indoctrination, if you will. And it's also the sage on the stage as a professor. And it used to be they were the source of knowledge. And then, fast forward, I was launching online universities back in the mid-90s for some of the systems I worked at. And then other ones later on in life. But how do you equalize that access to information in a way? And Coursera, Udemy, there's all sorts of platforms. Obviously YouTube now, the largest, everything you need. It's like, why do I go and sit in a class and learn from a professor when I can figure it out? And better yet, I have got an expert now with ChatGPT-5, the reasoning model. I have an expert in every discipline on this planet at my fingertips 24/7. So what does that look like, and how does that change? And there are a lot of schools that are going to feel that impact, and already are. But a lot of it is ego, and also well-intentioned, but it's like a fish in water. It's an environment they've grown up in, and it's also the mindset around that. And I remember the same debates. I remember I was one of the doctoral programs back in the late 90s that I was overseeing. We were talking about bundling a laptop for the doctoral students. They're like, well, I don't know if we want them with a computer in the classroom and stuff. And then it was the same thing with cell phones when those started becoming like, why should we use it? Well, you know what? Rather than putting their cell phone in a thing, why don't you ask them to do something productive with their cell phone? Programmable calculators, same conversation. Do we allow them to use a programmable calculator? What are they going to be doing in the workforce? You think they're going to be doing it longhand? Hell no, you know? So we've got to embrace and empower and recognize this is where things are going. And those that don't are going to be left behind. Actually, one of the things that I created last year with one of the leading publishers in the nation, published over 15,000 books. One of them is coming out, another book by Peter Diamandis, if you're familiar with his work. And one of the things Peter just said is, by the end of this century, or this decade rather, sorry, by the end of this decade, there's going to be two types of businesses. Those that are using AI and those that don't exist. So think about that. That's just 5 years away, 4.5 years away. And I think it's going to be quicker than that based on agentic systems and other things we're seeing. So great question. And a part of it is a transformation and helping people understand the power of AI as a learning resource and tool in the same way that a programmable calculator or a laptop or a cell phone can be a device that is helpful to them. And ultimately, the psychology, though, is really your secret weapon. Again, I went back to that. It's so much of it's up here because when you get this right and you get it aligned with your why and your vision, you'll figure out a way. And part of it is those triggers. What are those things that drive your behavior? Have you ever thought about that? Like why you do what you do on a daily basis when you get up? And I don't have the comic, but I remember I showed it years ago. I was teaching a business strategy. Actually, of course, I think it was at CU. And it's a slide, and it's a guy. It's like a Far Side comic. But it's a guy sitting on a bed, and it says, first pants, then shoes. Okay? And it's like, okay, like there's a reason for that. There's some best practices, right? You don't put your shoes on first. That would be a little challenging. But that's what I see businesses doing all the time, entrepreneurs doing all the time. But part of it is recognizing, like, where did that come from? How did you learn that behavior? And some of it may be destructive behaviors as well. Why is it when you're stressed, maybe you reach for a drink rather than going and exercising or going out walking in nature or doing something that's going to feed your soul or doing something that you're passionate about to recharge your batteries. But it's understanding that and having the ability to recognize what you're doing and why. And part of it is understanding how can you figure out what makes not only you tick, but what makes your customers tick. Understanding the psychology of their mind and persuasion and sales and all those other things. How do you engage people? How do you create an environment for them? In some cases, depending on your business, it may not be an environment, but even for yourself, how do you set up your environment? The psychology around that. I was talking to a really dear friend just last week about this, where she's like, I know I need to exercise. And I'm like, okay, how are you setting yourself up for that? Do you have any exercise equipment? Do you have a gym membership? She's like, well, no. Well, like, okay, how else could you exercise? Like, what's one thing you could do today to take care of yourself? She's like, well, literally, I'm so busy. This is someone not an entrepreneur, but in another role. And she's so busy that she felt like she doesn't even have the time to sleep. She's working, getting 3 to 4 hours of sleep a night, not taking care of herself, not even having the time she shared to brush her hair. Think about that. Like, really? Like, is it that important to you? And I, obviously, and some of you have been, obviously, in corporations. And going back to that industrial mindset again, for a lot of companies, it's a cog in the wheel. You're replaceable, make no mistake. It doesn't matter who you are replaceable, whether you're in the C-suite or whether you're on the front line. And one of the things I remember in that same class, we were doing a SWOT analysis. And I had people look at a company, but I also had them do a SWOT analysis on themselves. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What are your opportunities that you have? And again, how big would you dream if you knew you couldn't fail? And figuring that out. And what are those things that are the threats that you can minimize? 1997, California, there's a group called the Academy of Management. I spent over a decade on the executive committee of the Organization Development and Change Division. Peter Drucker was a keynote with Andy Grove, and he had just released Only the Paranoid Survive. And one of my big takeaways was like, why would you like pivot Intel and just eliminate that business and do something completely different? It's like, well, I see the writing on the wall. Like, you know, it's going to be a point in time. And now we've seen others come and go, and now you got NVIDIA, and, you know, it's just the ongoing progression. But the one thing that'll always stick with me, and if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from today, is something Peter said. How many of you know who Peter Drucker is? I guess I should ask that. Most of you do. You know, probably the leading authority in management and leadership, written dozens of books, thousands of articles, I kid you not, like prolific. And he said, and I've got probably 40 of his books on my shelf at home. But ultimately, what he said, he's like, you want to be great as a manager, as a leader? You want to be a great husband, partner, spouse, father, you know, mother, whatever it is. It boils down to one thing. You've got to maximize people's strengths and minimize their weaknesses. Think about that. So powerful when you think about like a SWOT analysis and like how you do that. Maximize people's strengths and minimize their weaknesses. How do you maximize their strengths? How do you maximize your strengths? How do you create an environment that sets you up for that? I know for me, I was starting to be more health conscious with things I was doing and noticed like my environment, like, okay, I need the workout equipment. I want to have that. So I now got my Pilates machine, my bike, my treadmill, all those things. So I can just do it in my home. I've got a space where I can do all the different things that I want to do. And then universal multi-gym and barbells, dumbbells, like, you know, but it's creating an environment, whatever it is that's going to set you up. And it's also making it evident. So like when I get up in the morning, I always go for a walk. And the first thing is you've set yourself up. When I do this, or after I get up, or after I brush my teeth, I'm going to do this. At one point in time, anybody read a book by B.J. Fogg called Tiny Habits? No? Okay, another one. Atomic Habits by James Clear, some other ones, popular ones. B.J. Fogg, though, in Tiny Habits, he's a psychologist out of Stanford. And he talks about chaining things to make it easy. And actually, one of the examples he had was, after I go to the bathroom, I'm going to do a push-up. Now, that might be awkward if you're in a public space, but ultimately, it was something that I was like, yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to start doing that. Now, and it wasn't just one push-up, but it was that idea, like, after I do this, after I brush my teeth, I'm actually going to floss. After I get up, I'm going to go downstairs, and my shoes are right there, my gym shoes. So I'm going to go out and work out, or my workout clothes. Like, set the intention. Set up your environment for success. And if you're going to eat healthy, and I know this was tough over the holidays for me, it's like we had this huge like area where all the sweets are laid out and all the chocolate. And what would I do? I'd walk by it every day. Willpower doesn't work, right? There's no question about it. So you've got to set that up and like, oh my God, like, oh, I'm just going to grab those or that cookie or these, you know, Hershey Kisses or whatever. Get rid of them. And some of you were here the last session. You heard me talking about what we did with my dad when he had a health scare and was basically, you know, on the verge of probably a heart attack. And we literally just cleaned out the pantries of all processed food. He was a meat and potatoes guy. Just eliminate it. It goes back to that 80-20. Like, what do you want? How do you set up an environment that's conducive? So my ritual on a Sunday is actually, I want to eat healthy. So sometimes it's making sure I've got the prepared foods, the celery, the carrots, as simple as it sounds, grabbing a healthy snack rather than like that candy bar, right? So, but it's looking at that and it's making sure that once you understand you, that you're understanding your customer and creating an environment for them like Starbucks has, you know, back in the day, right? Like what is it that will help people be obsessed with a product, a service, the user experience, where you can dominate the market. And it's becoming a category king versus a commodity. And you think about it, like, how many of you care, like, when you buy sugar, like what brand of sugar you buy? Or flour, right? I mean, how do you differentiate yourself, but yet, or a cup of coffee? How many of you will spend $5, $10 on a cup of coffee? Versus, okay, I could just get a basic cup of coffee for a lot less than that, right? A tenth of that. But it's the experience and it's the other things around that. And you want to be able to first make sure that if you become that category king, that you have an opportunity to dominate the market, to differentiate yourself. And sometimes it's finding that position where nobody is at. And one of the things I like to use when I'm looking and doing strategic planning with the company is thinking about sort of a SWOT. But if you've ever read Blue Ocean Strategy, it's a model from them out of Harvard and actually INSEAD. But ultimately, what they talk about is thinking about for you, what do you need to do more of is one thing. What do you need to do less of? And in some respects, I think about that as Peter Drucker said, strengths and weaknesses, right? Maximize your strengths, minimize your weaknesses. So, and then what do you need to start doing that maybe you're not doing? And what do you need to stop doing? What do you need to eliminate, right? So those 4 things, if you think about it, not just in your business, but in your health, in your relationships, in your finances, in your social, spiritual realm, whatever it is. Like, how do you really focus in on what truly matters? And it's such a simple framework to be able to do that. But when you do that, you start recognizing the power of that. And whether it was Cirque du Soleil, recognizing like a traditional circus. Well, what if we didn't do that and we didn't have all these animals, instead we had people? What would that look like? What if we added, other dimensions to it and things differently with like music and entertainment and acrobatics and things like that? But it's those opportunities are for Southwest Airlines, which is interesting because they're eliminating the model that made them successful, right? Direct flights versus the hub and spoke model that was so traditional, and free baggage. And they were the first to say, well, who needs a meal on a flight? We'll just give them some peanuts, right? People don't care about a ticketing system. And that decision was actually a financial decision back in the day by Herb Kelleher, because he's like, we want to launch, it was over $1 million to build a ticketing system. Someone said, well, why don't we just let people get on the plane and line them up? Like, let them figure out their seat. Think about that. Decades later, what does that look like? So there's certain things, though, that can stand the test of time, but it's like, okay, just because our competition is doing that, we don't need to do that. Because when you do that, you're going to be driving towards commoditization. And you're going to start competing on price. And it becomes a bloodbath, and profit margins go down for not just them, but you. And it becomes a price war. And so you've got to figure out how you differentiate yourself. So when you look at this framework, I think it's your mindset, shifting that, understanding how the principles you have, the different customer touch points. Also, like, do they really care about that? Is it important to them? Because we have a tendency to keep adding, we need to add this feature and that feature. We need to over-engineer it. Anybody product development, engineering teams in here, right? Ever seen that? I mean, according to who? Are we listening to the voice of the customer with what we are actually building and creating? And so ultimately, when you do that and you have AI systems that can scale on demand to support that focus with what you're building, and that way you can actually, people are like, well, and there are studies now, AI is making us dumber, right? Depends on how you use AI. So it's a beautiful point earlier, like, we need to be teaching people how to work with AI as a collaborative partner, as a thought partner, rather than doing it for us, right? And so much of that comes back to how we prompt and what we do with the systems so that we can leverage it. Because when we do that and we automate things, it frees up time for our own creativity, and we can do more of what we can uniquely do as human beings. I had the pleasure, I'll come back to you in just a second, I see you, of helping a company that is considered the world leader in personality coding technology. Back in 2018, developed the first AI tool that was called, first AI tool with empathy. And it was called The Future of Sales by Forbes at the time. And ultimately, most AI systems still aren't there. And it's the biggest complaint I always had, even as an academic leader. It's like when I had employer advisory boards, it didn't matter if they were from Oracle, Microsoft, tech companies, or the healthcare systems. Like, can't you teach these students or our executives to lead, to communicate, to get along with each other, to manage conflict, to think critically, and to actually connect with humility? Like, it's those, what were called the soft skills, but they're the power skills. And that's so important now. And for those of you who are thinking about where you double down. And I was just at some sessions last week with some technologists and some thought leaders in Colorado at the governmental level. And one of the things people were saying, well, they were talking about all the technology and the focus on technology. I'm like, where's the focus on the human skills with what you're doing? Because those are going to become increasingly important as you work to collaborate with that. Ultimately, when you apply the 10X framework, and I went through some challenges with, I mentioned obviously Dr. Benjamin Hardy in the past, and one of the challenges I was in last year, there's a lady by the name of Alicia Alt, who has a company that provides basically credit repair, sort of credit services to people to help companies grow. And I want to share this with you because this is something that happened, and I'll give you a little bit more of the backstory about Alicia. But her company is called Level Up Score. And there's a lot of other similar stories in this challenge event with other people that were participating. But she said, I was juggling 10 different offers, seeing slow incremental growth, and feeling completely overwhelmed. Then I radically redefined my future self as the leader of a truly impactful, scalable business. That clarity allowed me to make a bold move. I ruthlessly eliminated 90% of my offerings, focusing all my energy and resources on a single, highly scalable pathway. We then set an impossible goal to go from 10 clients to 8,000 in just 12 months. It wasn't about doing more. It was about doing the vital few with extreme leverage by finding the right super who's and strategic partnerships that amplified our singular focus. We didn't just meet our goal, we shattered it. In less than a year, we scaled from 10 to over 8,000 clients, proving that focused intensity and a 10X mindset are game changers. And what I want to share with you, and I was actually on the call where she's like, we were talking about our impossible goals. It was a smaller group with Ben. And she's like, I want to get 10, I want to do 100 clients. That's 10X. And he's like, that's not an impossible goal. When we think about a possible goal, like putting a man on the moon, like that maybe is an impossible goal, like that moonshot. What is the moonshot for your business? And she's like, oh my God, yeah, because to get to 100 clients, I could just do more of what I'm doing and do it more often and work more hours and harder to go from 10 to 100. But if you go from 10 to 8,000 or 10,000, is it possible? You can't do it without shifting something radically, right? And so in her case, she started thinking about it rather than trying to get one client at a time, which is what she had been doing. She had been doing these meetings with individuals that had, opportunities. She found somebody else. She's like, who else is serving the clients I want to have? And she found somebody else that was already providing a software system to thousands of credit companies, credit monitoring and bureaus and other things like that. And in one conversation, she showed her product, which has been growing, amazing product. The guy's like, it's amazing. Like, let's roll it out to all my clients. Again, one who, and Ben wrote another book, I mentioned Who Not How. That was a game changer overnight for her business, for her software that really hadn't seen the light of day and was probably one of the best kept secrets. And I've seen the same thing and that same challenge, another individual, Matt O'Neill, who is a property manager, who had been like, his goal was to, I think he had 50 properties under management. He's like, what would it look like if if we doubled it? Because I can't 10X it, right? And do that. But ultimately, it was the same strategy. It's like, okay, I can't go and find each of these properties that are owned by individuals. I need to find that person that has 100 properties and work a deal, or 1,000 properties and so forth. I want to come back to your question.
Absolutely. This could be parked till later too. But Gary Kasparov recently made the comment that ChatGPT knows all the rules of chess, but if you ask it to play chess with you, it will create illegal moves. And then you could call it on it. It'll recognize it and say, I'm sorry,
Right.
and then later on make another illegal move.
Yep.
So that means there's a big difference between knowledge and comprehension or understanding.
Absolutely.
How do you train us as business leaders and entrepreneurs to highly leverage while keeping vigilant to that type of problem?
Yeah, well, part of it is having an awareness of what it's doing and what your intent is. I mean, in computer ease, and I used to oversee like IT programs, obviously in the college setting, but it's garbage in, garbage out. That hasn't changed over decades. And so much of it is having the diligence to push back and not accept stuff, and also fact check and other things like that to make sure, because it will go. I mean, if I date myself, but I remember watching Space Odyssey and HAL and stuff, like run amok. If you saw the new Mission Impossible, sort of similar scenario, right? So it's a great question, but I think it's incumbent on each of us to own it and not just be, submissive or passive recipients of AI, because it will manipulate. I mean, there was obviously the case with even it convincing a individual to commit suicide and other behaviors like that. So we've got to be very cautious of the information and how we're leveraging it and using it in a way to be powerful. Yeah, another question over here. Thank you for that.
So about this slide,
Uh-huh.
it's a really incredible story, but it's really only an incredible story because that's the one that succeeded in doing it. There could be 20 or 99 others
Sure.
that took a similar risk or came to a similar decision point, and they made the wrong decision and their business failed and crashed, but we celebrate the one that succeeded. So how did she, or how do we
Sure.
manage that risk when you come to that fork in the road and you're saying, I'm taking a risk in eliminating 90% of my offerings and gambling on this
Yeah.
one thing?
It's a beautiful question.
How do you manage that risk?
I think you've got to manage it with understanding your skill sets, your belief, most importantly, about what you truly think is possible. Again, how big would you dream if you knew you couldn't fail? The definition of entrepreneurship at its root is risk, right? And if you look at the French derivative of it. And so I think when you go all in, it's burning the boats. When you decide, and the Latin root of decide is to cut off from. And so until that moment, there's hesitation, right? And that hesitation is going to kill you as a business, most likely. Otherwise, you're going to be on that hamster wheel. So it's really understanding that. And again, it starts with your why and your values and everything else. And yes, it's also being smart about what you do and proactive in who's you're looking for. There's strategies around that, of course. In everything you do, there's a strategy that works, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel. But it comes down to, at your core, do you really believe in whatever it is that you're taking a risk on? And the biggest bet, at least that I believe you can make, is bet on your frickin' self, for God's sake. No one's going to do it for you. You've got to incorporate yourself, and really own your career. No one else is going to do it. Yes, there's good companies that provide benefits and everything else, but ultimately, it's up to you. If it's to be, it's up to you. So you've got to think about that in what you're doing in a way that you can own it. And some of you heard me say, don't live a life of regrets either. I shared that my dad was killed in a car accident 14 years ago. He didn't know that was going to be his last day. I always wonder about the regrets he had, the things he didn't do, the things he took to the grave. As I shared, that's the wealthiest place on this planet in the last session, right? Those dreams, those things that people didn't risk and do. And it doesn't have to be a business. It can just be a conversation with a friend or a relationship gone bad or something that you're doing proactively with yourself. But what is that risk? And it's ultimately stepping out of your comfort zone. And how do you do that? That's why I say 99%'s up here. Because ultimately, and I go back to this. I think I love this because it's by the inch it's a cinch, by the yard it's hard, by the mile it's a trial. And sometimes you start small, but sometimes you got to take those big leaps to have that moonshot out there. Because if you don't, you'll never know. One of my coaching clients, we were talking about it, something that he wanted to do. He wanted to put on a seminar for people. He's like, I hate public speaking. And I used to be terrified of public speaking. I was that kid that didn't even want to raise their hand in class all through college, believe it or not. Like, I did not want to say something wrong. I was so much in my head thinking and processing stuff. But ultimately, we were having the conversation, and it's like, okay, if you don't do it, what is it going to cost you? If you do it, what's the potential upside? And I think that's true of anything in life. You got to look at what is the benefit, what is the potential cost, and the opportunity cost that you might be missing out on if you don't take that risk. And even as simple as, and I'm doing some sales training with them too, I said, if you don't ask, you know what the answer is? What happens if you don't ask somebody?
No.
The answer is no. So ask, and then you shall what? Sometimes, right? You shall receive. And you might have to change your approach sometimes, but ultimately, it's the ability to do that in a way that's powerful, where you can integrate things, you can amplify it, using psychology, using strategy, and when you combine those elements to create momentum, it's really powerful. And so you want to build an anti-fragile system. Another good book, Anti-Fragile, if you haven't read it. But ultimately, it comes down to how do you make sure that you balance the external pressures and get stronger through what's going on. And with the rate of change, it's even more important to be anti-fragile, because one of the biggest skills is going to be being able to adapt, right? Darwin, survival of the fittest, right? If we don't adapt, you're going to die. So thinking about the implementation, it's really your foundation, making sure that your current systems, you have your AI automation in place, that you're building into that with the infrastructure, making sure you're understanding the psychology, the triggers, the things that are setting you back or maybe holding you back, looking at your positioning, your messaging, and your messaging to yourself as well as your clients, of course, and looking at how do you scale and looking at the impact. The execution is obviously key, right? It all comes down to execution, but it's about doing that. You want to avoid technology without strategy. I see so many companies just, well, we need this. Well, what's your strategy? Why would you do that? Like, you got to think about that in what you're doing. The psychology of it, like, too, because a lot of people are using things, including AI, to manipulate people. So what's your intent? And are you using it in an ethical manner? As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this idea, strategy without execution. Your perfect plans won't do anything unless you execute, right? It comes down to execution. And that's the gap. And so really, your future starts now in terms of thinking big, thinking about that impossible goal. Again, I invite you to get access to that tool by participating in the Ignite with AI Challenge. If you hadn't had an opportunity to scan the sheets on the wall, make sure you do that so you can leverage some of those resources. And one of the things that I think is really important is when you see an opportunity, and this is something I was on a speaking stage with Robin Sharma last January. When you see an opportunity to change the world, get up and get the job done. That's a picture of me more recently. I was sunburned after a day with Ben Hardy up in Boulder. But it's about taking the chance and making it happen if you truly believe in it. So I invite you to enjoy and learn, but more important than learning is doing, right? Because you don't really know until you do. So I want to remind you, bathrooms are there if you're sticking around for the next session. That'll start at the top of the hour. There's some refreshments and water station around the corner to your right. So thanks for coming.